The heavy oak door didn't just shut, it severed. The brass deadbolt engaged with a sharp, metallic click that echoed across the manicured front lawn, a sound so final it felt like a physical blow to her spine. She stood frozen on the cracked asphalt of the driveway, the humid summer air pressing down on her shoulders like a wet woolen blanket. In her weathered hands, she clutched a single cardboard box, its seams reinforced with overlapping layers of yellowing packing tape. Inside was the entirety of her 79 years that still held any tangible weight. A few faded photographs, a silver thimble from her mother, a pair of orthopedic shoes, and a change of clothes. Through the frosted glass pane of the door, she saw the silhouette of her son-in-law turn away without a backward glance. He didn't look out the window to see where she would go. He didn't care. To him, and to the daughter who had signed the transfer deeds with an indifferent flourish of a designer pen, she was simply an administrative problem that had finally been resolved. The home she had scrubbed, painted, and filled with 40 years of laughter and grief was no longer hers. The suburban dream had transformed into a corporate eviction notice, leaving her standing on the outside of her own life, looking in at a closed door. Her knees trembled slightly, not from the frailty of her 79 years, but from the sudden, terrifying lightness of her existence. Everything she had built, every sacrifice she had made to keep that roof over her family's heads after her husband passed, had been liquidated into a series of legal loopholes. The modern world had no use for an old woman whose memory outlasted her utility. She looked down at her fingers, knobby and calloused, gripping the rough cardboard. A stray tear escaped her eye, tracking through the deep lines of her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. She refused to let them see her bow her head, even if they were only watching from behind closed blinds. Crammed into the side pocket of the box, sticking out just enough to catch the midday sun, was a crumpled sheath of legal documents. It was the only paperwork her son-in-law hadn't managed to contest or seize, mostly because his expensive lawyers had deemed it completely worthless. The deed detailed a legally ironclad asset, inherited decades ago from an eccentric, long-dead uncle, whom the family had always spoken of in hushed, embarrassed whispers. While the main estate, the investments, and the vehicles had been systematically stripped from her grasp through a web of power of attorney clauses, this single piece of paper remained solely in her name. It was a deed to a derelict, century-old ice house located 5 miles outside the town limits, tucked away in a hollow where the interstate didn't reach. To the rest of the family, the property was a joke, a rotting tax liability, a crumbling pile of timber and stone from a bygone era before electrical grids and modern refrigeration rendered ice harvesting obsolete. Her son-in-law had laughed when he found the deed in the safe deposit box, calling it a monument to stupidity. Yet, in her darkest hour, that useless piece of dirt was the only anchor she had left in a world that had cut her adrift. She turned her back on the house, her sensible shoes clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the curb. The neighborhood was quiet, the neighbors staying safely behind their curtains, unwilling to witness the quiet tragedy unfolding on the street. She didn't blame them. Complicity was easier when you didn't look it in the eye. Reaching the sidewalk, she set the heavy box down for a moment to unfold the deed. The parchment was thick and yellowed, smelling faintly of wood smoke and old dust. The ink was faded but legible, bearing the official seal of the county from a time when horse-drawn wagons still delivered blocks of frozen river water to wealthy households. Her uncle had been a strange, secretive man who spent his final years hoarding junk and living like a hermit inside that monolithic structure. The family had abandoned him, just as they were abandoning her now. There was a poetic, bitter irony in the fact that his madness was now her only sanctuary. She didn't know what state the building was in. She hadn't seen it since she was a little girl, back when the towering walls seemed like a fortress designed to keep the summer heat at bay. She remembered the smell of wet sawdust and the intense, unnatural cold that clung to the stone foundations even in July. She folded the paper back up and tucked it securely into her coat pocket, her resolve hardening. 79 years did not make her weak. It made her a survivor. She had outlived a war, a recession, and the loss of the only man who had ever truly loved her. If her family thought this eviction would break her spirit, they had severely underestimated the steel in her bones. She picked up the cardboard box again, shifting its weight against her hip. and looked down the long, empty road that led away from the suburbs. A block away, a rusted yellow taxi pulled up to the curb, its engine idling with a loud, rhythmic sputter. She had used her last $20 bill to call it, knowing that once she got into that back seat, there would be no turning back. She walked toward the car without looking behind her. The house on the hill, with its manicured lawn and its heavy oak door, was already fading into a past that no longer belonged to her. Ahead lay a forgotten relic of industrial history, a monument to a cold, hard past that was waiting for her in the shadows of the valley. She opened the cab door, slid onto the cracked vinyl seat, and gave the driver the coordinates written on the back of the ancient deed. The rusted yellow taxi rattled down the winding, single-lane road, where the asphalt gradually gave way to gravel and potholes. He kept his hands tight on the cracked steering wheel, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the silent passenger in his back seat. He had driven a cab in this county for 20 years, but he had never dropped anyone off this far out into the hollow. The trees grew thick and untamed here, their branches weaving a low canopy that blocked out the midday sun, casting long, bruised shadows across the dirt road. When the car finally sputtered to a halt, the tires kicked up a thick cloud of red dust that hung motionless in the heavy, humid air. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence of the woods was deafening. Through the bug-splattered windshield, the destination loomed like a ghost from an industrial graveyard. The plot of land was entirely overgrown, swallowed by a dense sea of waist-high weeds, wild briars, and jagged thistles. Rising from the center of this neglected wilderness was the ice house. It was a massive, windowless monolith constructed from blackened, rotting timber and panels of corrugated iron that had rusted into a deep, bloody crimson. Dead, brittle ivy clung to the exterior walls like skeletal fingers, tracing the cracks in the wood. It was a useless relic, an architectural fossil from a forgotten century before electricity changed the world, completely detached from the modern town 5 miles behind them. He climbed out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel, and opened the rear door for her. He lifted her single, taped-up cardboard box from the seat, its light weight telling him everything he needed to know about her circumstances. As she stepped out into the crushing summer heat, he looked at her frail frame, then back at the ominous, decaying structure. Pity welled up in his chest. He knew exactly what this place was. Everyone in the county did. The local town council considered the property a toxic liability, a worthless, dangerous eyesore that had been slated for demolition for nearly a decade, preserved only by a tangled web of ancient zoning laws and forgotten deeds. He offered her the box, his voice softening as he spoke. He asked her if she was sure about this, pointing out that there was no running water, no electricity, and definitely no shelter fit for a human being within miles. She took the box from him with a firm, steady grip, her chin tilting upward in a silent display of defiance that caught him off guard. She didn't answer with words, she simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the towering facade of the iron and wood monument. Recognizing the stubborn finality in her eyes, he sighed, reached into his pocket, and handed her his business card, telling her to call if she changed her mind. He watched her set the box down by the edge of the weeds and begin her slow, deliberate march toward the structure. Her sensible shoes sank into the damp earth as she forced her way through the tangled brush. The closer she got, the more massive the ice house became, blocking out the sky. The main entrance was a pair of heavy, reinforced timber doors, thick enough to have once kept out the fiercest summer heat, now weathered and grayed by a century of storms. Holding the doors shut was a thick, oxidized iron chain, secured by a massive padlock that had rusted into a solid, unyielding lump of orange metal. She reached out and touched the lock. It was warm from the sun, fused shut by decades of neglect. She didn't hesitate. She looked around the base of the foundation until she found a heavy, jagged river stone half buried in the dirt. At 79, her movements were deliberate, but they carried the weight of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She hoisted the stone with both hands, her muscles straining against the weight, and brought it down hard against the padlock. The sound of stone striking iron cracked through the quiet woods like a rifle shot. He watched from the safety of his taxi, his breath catching in his throat as the old woman struck the lock a second time, then a third, her face set in a mask of pure determination. On the fourth strike, the brittle, rusted internal mechanisms of the lock finally gave way. The padlock snapped, the heavy iron chain clattering loudly against the timber doors before sliding to the dirt. She dropped the stone, her breaths coming in short, ragged gasps, but she didn't pause to rest. She pressed her palms against the rough, splintered wood of the right door and pushed with the entirety of her weight. The ancient iron hinges groaned aloud, screaming in protest as they tore through decades of rust and grime, slowly yielding a gap wide enough for a person to pass. A wave of air escaped from the interior, washing over her. It was a suffocating, complex scent, a heavy mixture of damp shadows, ancient sawdust, stagnant river mud, and the unmistakable aroma of a place that had been sealed away from the living world for a lifetime. She picked up her cardboard box from the edge of the path, holding it against her chest like a shield, and stepped across the threshold into the dark. Behind her, the taxi driver watched her silhouette vanish into the gloom of the cavernous interior. He shook his head, a heavy feeling of dread in his stomach, before climbing back into his car and backing down the long, forgotten road, leaving her entirely alone with the relic of her past. The moment she stepped deeper into the gloom, crossing the invisible boundary where the midday sun couldn't reach, the suffocating humidity of the Maryland summer vanished. It didn't just fade, it was instantly replaced by a sharp, biting drafts that made the tiny hairs on her arms stand up. The air shifted dramatically, turning unnaturally cold, carrying a crisp dryness that belonged to a January blizzard rather than a July afternoon. She breathed in, and a faint plume of condensation escaped her lips, vanishing into the darkness. It was an impossible sensation, a pocket of winter trapped inside a decaying summer shell, defying the sweltering heat baking the corrugated iron roof just feet above her. She set her cardboard box on a relatively dry patch of earth and pulled her thin coat tighter around her chest. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracked doorway, the true scale of the structure began to reveal itself. This was not just a barn or a warehouse. It was an intricate, monumental machine designed for preservation. She was standing on a catwalk that overlooked a massive, yawning cavern that dropped deep into the earth. The walls were immense, constructed with a double-layered design, thick, rough-hewn stone on the outside, a 3-foot gap filled with petrified sawdust and charcoal, and an inner wall of dense, pitch-treated timber. It was a brilliant, low-tech thermos, designed a century ago to trap frost and hold it hostage against the turning of the earth. Guided by the faint light, she found a narrow wooden staircase leading down into the subterranean chambers. The steps creaked beneath her sensible shoes, but the old wood held, preserved by the very dryness that chilled her bones. Reaching the floor of the first sublevel, she began to explore. The air grew progressively colder with every foot she descended, dropping well into the low 40s. Her hands, though stiffening, began to clear away decades of surface debris, discarded iron hooks, rotted canvas tarps, and piles of ancient burlap sacks that fell to dust at her touch. She swept away layers of petrified wood shavings with a broken broom handle she found near the stairs, uncovering the massive stone floor slabs beneath. The deeper she went, the more she realized the incredible genius of the architecture. The building's unique insulation hadn't just kept the heat out, it had completely sealed the deepest basement from the outside world's atmosphere. There were no drafts down here, no moisture from the humid valley, no insects, and no rot. The air was sterile, frozen in time, smelling faintly of old pine and deep frost. The absolute silence of the subterranean vault was broken only by the sound of her own rhythmic breathing and the distant muffled hum of the world above. It was an isolation so profound it felt holy, a sanctuary carved out of ice and memory, where the pain of her eviction couldn't reach her. By the time evening arrived, the faint light from the doorway above had died out, plunging the upper levels into shadow. She had managed to clear a small corner of the first subterranean room, laying out her spare clothes as a makeshift mattress on a clean wooden bench. Suddenly, a beam of bright artificial light pierced the darkness from the main entrance, cutting through the shadows like a blade. The heavy crunch of boots on the gravel above echoed down the stairwell, followed by a hesitant, booming voice calling out into the cavern. She stood up, her muscles aching from the unaccustomed labor, and watched as a silhouette descended the stairs, holding a heavy-duty flashlight. It was a man in his late 30s, wearing heavy flannel and hiking boots, his face etched with concern. He was a local historian who had spent years documenting the county's disappearing industrial landmarks, and he had tracked her down after hearing a frantic report from the taxi driver about an elderly woman being abandoned at the notorious township eyesore. He had rushed out here with a medical kit and a flashlight, fully intending to warn her about the building's severe structural dangers, the threat of cave-ins, and the toxic liabilities the town council always ranted about. He had expected to find a fragile, freezing woman shivering in a dangerous, rotting shack. Instead, as his flashlight beam swept across the massive, double-walled stone chambers, the words died in his throat. He stopped on the middle step, his jaw dropping as he took in the immaculate state of the preservation. The beam of his light caught the pristine, pitch-treated timber walls, completely free of the mold and decay that plagued every other century-old building in the state. He stepped down onto the stone floor, his historical training overriding his panic. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the dry, freezing stone of the inner vault. He breathed in the sterile, chilled air, realizing instantly that the structure's ingenious insulation matrix had worked perfectly for over 100 years. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and disbelief. He forgot his speech about the town's demolition order, forgot the danger, forgot the hour. He murmured that this wasn't a ruin, it was an architectural miracle, a perfectly preserved time capsule of early American engineering, hidden in plain sight. She watched him from the shadows, a faint, knowing smile touching her lips. For the first time since the heavy oak door of her home had slammed shut, she didn't feel like a discarded relic. In the freezing heart of this worthless ice house, she had found someone who saw the exact same thing she did, a monument that refused to fade. The local historian did not leave. Instead, his initial shock transformed into a feverish professional curiosity that matched her own quiet determination. He returned to his truck and brought back 2 heavy iron shovels, a pair of rugged work gloves for her, and a battery-powered halogen lantern that flooded the subterranean chamber with a crisp, stark white light. The cold in the deepest basement had settled into a steady, dry 38 degrees, a temperature that kept their breath pluming in the air but warded off the fatigue of the physical labor. Together, they stood at the absolute bottom of the ice house, facing a massive floor covered in a thick, compacted mountain of ancient sawdust. For decades, this sawdust had served as the final, impenetrable barrier of insulation, a dense blanket designed to keep the summer heat from rising through the earth. Over a century, the moisture had been completely siphoned out of the wood shavings, leaving them petrified, light, and powdery, like a gray desert of frozen ash. They began to excavate, their movements falling into a rhythmic, silent cadence. He handled the heavy lifting, driving the iron spade deep into the compacted layers and tossing the debris into the far corners of the vault. She worked beside him with a smaller hand trowel, clearing the perimeter along the massive pine floorboards, her 99-year-old family legacy driving her hands forward without a hint of tremor. The work was grueling, but the sterile, chilled air kept them from sweating, preserving their energy in the strange, subterranean vacuum. As they cleared away the first 2 feet of the petrified insulation, the air grew even crisper, smelling intensely of old resin and ancient earth. The historian stopped for a moment, wiping a layer of gray dust from his forehead, his eyes sweeping the area they had uncovered. He remarked that the depth of the flooring didn't match the external blueprints he had studied in the county archives. The foundations were too deep, the timber too heavily reinforced for a simple ice storage pool. There was an intentionality to the construction that went far beyond commercial utility. An hour later, his heavy iron shovel struck something that did not yield with the soft, muted thud of wood or the dry crunch of sawdust. It was a sharp, metallic ring that vibrated through the handles of their tools, echoing loudly off the double-walled stone chambers. He froze, his gaze instantly dropping to the spot. He dropped to his knees, abandoning the shovel, and used his gloved hands to frantically brush away the remaining inches of powdery gray wood. He unclipped his high-powered flashlight from his belt, focusing its intense, concentrated beam directly into the shallow trench they had dug. The bright light caught a sudden, blinding gleam of silver. It wasn't the dull gray of rusted iron or the dark patina of copper, but the bright, untarnished flash of industrial-grade stainless steel. Buried deep within a custom-carved recess in the thick subflooring was a massive, heavy structural vault lid. It was wrapped in thick layers of tar-treated waterproof canvas, which had kept the metal completely pristine, untouched by the passage of time or the dampness of the surrounding valley. The canvas was bound by heavy steel straps, sealed with lead stamps bearing a date that made the historian's breath catch in his throat, October 1929. She knelt beside him, her hands reaching out to touch the freezing, rubbery surface of the treated canvas. The date was unmistakable. It was the exact month and year the American stock market collapsed, plunging the nation into the dark abyss of the Great Depression. Her eccentric uncle had not been hoarding ice during those final, chaotic years of his life. He had been constructing a fortress. While the banks were failing and families were losing everything, he had used his wealth and the unique, climate-controlled isolation of this monolithic structure to hide something completely out of reach of the crashing economy. Working together, they used the edge of her hand trowel to slice through the brittle, century-old canvas wrapping. The fabric peeled away with a loud, tearing hiss, revealing a series of meticulously crated, airtight, military-grade security vaults beneath. The vaults were bolted directly into the bedrock of the valley, completely integrated into the very architecture of the ice house. There were 6 vaults in total, each one fitted with heavy mechanical combination locks that remained as bright and rust-free as the day they were forged in a pre-war foundry. He shined his flashlight closer, his fingers tracing the engraved brass plates on the center vault. The labels didn't indicate currency or gold, but rather the names of prominent photographic registries and private national estates from the turn of the century. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. They had uncovered not a cache of frozen river water, and not a hoard of useless family junk, but a sequence of custom-engineered, moisture-sealed, temperature-regulated vaults hidden at the precipice of the country's greatest financial ruin. She looked at the gleaming steel boxes, then up at the towering, dark timber walls above them. The worthless eyesore her family had thrown her out to die in was sitting on top of a hidden, impenetrable sanctuary of American history. The mechanical combination lock on the first stainless steel vault resisted for only a fraction of a second before the heavy internal tumblers clicked into place, yielding to the exact sequence her uncle had scratched onto the back of the ancient deed. He threw his weight against the heavy lever, and the airtight seal broke with a sharp, pressurized hiss that sounded like a breath trapped for 100 years finally being released. The thick steel door swung outward on grease-packed hinges that moved as smoothly as silk. The halogen lantern flooded the interior of the vault, revealing row after row of custom-built cedar racks, completely free of dust, mold, or decay. Inside the racks sat thousands of heavy rectangular glass plate negatives, separated by thin sheets of acid-free vellum paper. She reached out, her fingertips trembling slightly against the cold, and slid the first glass plate from its slot. Holding it up to the stark white light of the halogen lamp, her breath caught in her throat. The image was perfectly sharp, rendered in breathtaking, silver halide detail. It was a lost master photograph from the dawn of the 20th century, capturing a bustling, smoke-filled New York street scene from an era long since buried under skyscrapers. The faces of the immigrants stepping off the boats, the sweat on the brows of the steelworkers balancing on high beams, the raw, unfiltered pulse of a nation building its foundation, all of it was captured with a clarity that modern digital cameras could barely replicate. As they carefully catalogued the first few racks, the true genius of her uncle's madness became blindingly clear. He had never been a simple eccentric hoarding useless junk in the woods. He was a visionary archivist who had recognized a profound technological truth before anyone else. Photographic emulsions on glass plates required a very specific, unchanging environment to survive. Low humidity to prevent the gelatin from melting, and a constant freezing temperature to halt the chemical degradation of the silver. The unique double-walled stone and sawdust insulation of the ice house hadn't just kept river ice frozen, it had created the most technologically perfect, natural climate-controlled vault on the North American continent. He had systematically bought up the undocumented, abandoned archives of the country's early photographic masters, right as the industrial age threatened to pave over them. She looked deeper into the crate, finding leather-bound logs detailing the contents. The collection contained lost, unreleased works by legendary master photographers, names that defined the American artistic consciousness, men and women who had documented the raw frontier, the brutal realities of the Civil War reconstruction, and the intimate, forgotten faces of indigenous tribes. These weren't copies or reprints. These were the original, undocumented masterplates, thought to have been destroyed in the Great Archive fires of the mid-1930s. Her uncle had saved them all, smuggling them out of the cities and burying them deep beneath the Maryland dirt, just as the financial world collapsed in 1929. He stood beside her, his hands holding his head in absolute reverence as he looked at a plate depicting a famous, lost portrait of Abraham Lincoln taken days before his Gettysburg Address, a variation the historical community believed was nothing more than a myth. The historian's voice was nothing more than a ragged whisper as he muttered that the archive was priceless. It wasn't just a collection of old pictures. It was the visual DNA of the country, an unedited, raw chronicle of faces, moments, and historical truths, thought forgotten forever. The crisp, cold air of the vault seemed to vibrate with the spirits of the millions of souls trapped in the silver gelatin, waiting for a century for someone to open the door and let them look back at the world. She leaned against the cold steel of the vault door, a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity washing over her. The family that had discarded her, the son-in-law who had locked her out on the asphalt, the daughter who had traded her childhood memories for a bigger bank account. They had looked at this land and seen nothing but a worthless eyesore slated for a bulldozer. They had judged her worth by her age and this property by its decay, completely blind to the fact that the most valuable historical treasure trove in modern history was resting quietly beneath the weeds. Her uncle hadn't left her a burden. He had left her a legacy, appointing her the sole guardian of the nation's forgotten soul. She tightened her grip on her coat, her eyes reflecting the silver gleam of the glass plates, knowing that the narrative of her life had just completely shifted. By dawn, the cold subterranean chamber felt less like a tomb and more like a command center. He sat on an upturned wooden crate, his laptop plugged into a portable battery pack, firing off urgent encrypted emails to the senior director of the Smithsonian Institution and the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Attached to those messages were high-resolution digital scans of the Lincoln plate and a dozen other master glass negatives they had photographed using his phone. He knew the clock was ticking. Outside the heavy timber doors, the morning sun was rising over the valley, and with it came the very real threat of the local township enforcement. The county had already issued a preliminary condemnation order on the property, and a predatory local development firm had been circling the plot for months, eager to bulldoze the structure to build a suburban strip mall. He stayed by the entrance of the ice house throughout the morning, physically blocking the overgrown path, when a representative from the development company arrived with a surveyor's team. The man, wearing a sharp suit that looked entirely out of place in the briars, waved a piece of paper and demanded to inspect the interior for environmental hazards. He didn't budge. He stood on the graying porch, his arms crossed, throwing his weight and his credentials as a registered local historian around like a shield. He informed them that the property was currently under an active federal archival review, and that any attempt to breach the perimeter would result in a massive, highly publicized civil suit. He shielded her completely, keeping her downstairs in the safety of the cool vault so she wouldn't have to face their aggressive legal intimidation. Just before noon, the gravel road outside erupted with the sounds of a motorcade. 3 black government SUVs tore through the weeds, kicking up dust as they came to a sudden halt behind the taxi driver's old tire tracks. Out stepped the chief curator of the National Photographic Archives, flanked by 2 senior forensic appraisers and a pair of armed federal security officers. The historian ushered them down into the freezing depths of the structure, where she stood waiting, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, her expression calm and unreadable. The team of experts didn't say a word as they approached the open stainless steel vault. They slipped on specialized nitrile gloves, adjusted their magnifying visors, and began the meticulous process of verification. For 3 agonizing hours, the only sounds in the subterranean vault were the rhythmic clicks of appraisers' loops, the soft rustle of acid-free paper, and the sharp, collective gasps of the academic team. They checked the chemical composition of the silver halide emulsions, verified the unique watermarks on the glass plates, and cross-referenced the logbooks with long-lost federal registries from the late 1920s. The chief curator finally stepped back from the racks, his hands trembling so violently he had to grip the edge of the steel door to steady himself. He turned to her, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and deep reverence, and declared that the archive was not just authentic, it was a flawless cultural treasure trove that completely rewrote the history of early American photography. The formal evaluation paper was drawn up right there on the cedar work table. The preliminary appraisal estimated the collection's value in the tens of millions of dollars, but the monetary figure was secondary to its historical impact. The archive contained over 4,000 completely unique plates that filled crucial, missing gaps in the nation's foundational record, rendering it one of the most significant historical discoveries of the 21st century. With a single stroke of a pen, the legal status of the derelict icehouse transformed overnight. Utilizing an emergency executive clause for the preservation of irreplaceable national heritage, the federal team issued an immediate injunction against the local township. The worthless eyesore, the toxic liability her son-in-law had used to justify her eviction, was instantly reclassified as a protected national historical landmark. Before the sun began to dip below the tree line, federal seals were affixed to the rusted iron chains at the main entrance, placing the entire property under government protection. The predatory developers and the local councilmen who had arrived with demolition threats were forced to retreat down the gravel road, their legal notices rendered entirely useless by the weight of federal law. She stood at the top of the cellar stairs, watching the black SUVs establish a permanent security perimeter at the edge of the woods. The structure that was meant to be her final, lonely resting place had just become an unassailable fortress, and she was its undisputed sovereign. The news of the multi-million-dollar federal archive traveled fast, splashing across national headlines and local television broadcasts by the following afternoon. It didn't take long for the vultures to trace the treasure back to the old woman they had cast out. By midday, a familiar luxury SUV tore down the gravel road, its pristine white paint job getting caked in the dust of the hollow. The vehicle slammed to a halt just outside the newly established federal security perimeter. Out stepped her daughter and son-in-law, their faces flushed not with anger this time, but with a frantic, synthetic warmth. They carried designer overnight bags and wore expressions of deep, performative remorse, eager to undo the damage of the previous week. She didn't meet them inside the historic vault, nor did she grant them access to the secure facility. Instead, she stood on the metal porch of a comfortable, temporary mobile trailer that the National Archival Institute had set up for her beside the ice house. He stood a few paces behind her, a quiet, vigilant presence, holding a clipboard that detailed the property's strict new non-trespass protocols. As her family approached the porch, her daughter began to weep on cue, calling out to her, offering a barrage of hollow apologies about a terrible misunderstanding and the stress of the estate transition. The son-in-law, entirely stripping away his previous hostility, smiled warmly and stepped forward, holding out a set of keys to a new, luxurious guest suite they had supposedly prepared for her back at the family estate. They laid out their trap with practiced ease. They told her she shouldn't have to live in a trailer in the woods at 79. They offered to take her back home, to take care of her medical bills, and to handle the overwhelming logistics of managing the historical landmark on her behalf. All they needed, the son-in-law smoothly added, was for her to sign a simple management proxy, a document that would give them legal control of the asset so she could rest. They spoke to her as if she were still the fragile, disposable problem they had locked out on the asphalt, fully expecting her to jump at the chance for their validation and comfort. She looked down at them from the top of the metal steps, her hands resting lightly on the railing. The humid summer wind rustled her thin coat, but she didn't shiver. For 40 years she had allowed herself to believe that her value as a human being was tied to their approval, that her role as a mother and a grandmother required her to absorb their disrespect in silence. But looking at their eager, desperate eyes, she saw them clearly for the first time. They didn't see a mother, they saw a dollar sign wrapped in an old woman's frame. The realization brought with it a profound, liberating stillness. Her worth had never been something they had the power to grant or steal. She did not raise her voice. She didn't recount the pain of the slamming oak door or the cold humiliation of the cardboard box. With quiet, absolute dignity, She looked her son-in-law dead in the eye and told him to keep his keys. She informed them, her voice steady and cutting through the quiet woods like a diamond on glass, that the ice house and everything inside it was legally secured under a permanent federal trust that they could never touch. She thanked them for showing her exactly who they were when she had nothing, because it made it remarkably easy to decide who they would be to her now that she had everything. Her daughter reached out, her voice rising in a desperate pitch, begging her to reconsider, but she simply turned her back on them. She signaled to the federal security officers stationed at the gate, who immediately stepped forward to escort the trespassing luxury vehicle off the landmark grounds. As the SUV backed down the dirt road in defeat, its tires spitting gravel into the brush, she stood on the porch and breathed in the fresh summer air. The table had turned completely. She was no longer an evicted castaway begging for a corner of her own home. She was a woman of independent substance, standing on her own land, completely free of their toxic validation. The gravel road that once bled into the overgrown hollow was now a beautifully paved, two-lane boulevard lined with young maples and historic bronze plaques. On this crisp autumn morning, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air carried a sharp, refreshing chill that mirrored the interior of the monolith at the center of the grounds. The derelict ice house had been transformed. The rotting timber and rusted corrugated iron had not been torn down. Instead, they had been meticulously stabilized and integrated into a stunning, state-of-the-art glass and steel museum pavilion that wrapped around the original structure like a protective jewel box. Dozens of press cameras flashed, and a crowd of hundreds, historians, citizens, and national dignitaries, sat in rows of white chairs facing a grand wooden stage. She stood at the center of that stage, leaning slightly against the polished walnut podium, looking out over the crowd. At 79, she wore a tailored wool suit, her silver hair catching the morning light, her posture radiating an absolute, unshakable authority. She was no longer the forgotten woman clutching a taped-up cardboard box on a suburban driveway. She was the founding benefactor of the National Archive at the Ice House. Behind her, a massive velvet curtain parted to reveal giant, crystal-clear digital projections of the master glass negatives she had pulled from the dust. The hauntingly beautiful faces of an older, stronger America stepping into the light for the very first time. Her future was ironclad, her financial independence absolute, and her name was permanently etched into the cultural history of the country. He stood just a few paces to her left, wearing a sharp charcoal suit that replaced his old work flannel, a proud smile warming his face. He had officially been named the museum's chief curator, a lifetime appointment that ensured the sanctuary they had excavated together would be guarded by someone who understood its true soul. As the applause washed over the stage, he caught her eye and gave a small, respectful nod. They had started as two strangers in a freezing basement, fighting against predatory developers and a ticking clock, and they had ended up saving a piece of the nation's identity. When the applause finally settled, she leaned toward the microphone. Her voice did not tremble. It carried across the pavilion with a quiet, resonant power that captivated every person in attendance. She didn't speak of betrayal, and she didn't mention the family members who were currently barred from the property by federal injunction. Instead, she spoke about the things the world discards because they look old, weathered, or obsolete. She told the crowd that the truest legacies are often hidden in the places people refuse to look, buried beneath the sawdust of time, waiting for someone with enough patience to break the lock. With a final, elegant gesture, she cut the red ribbon stretched across the pavilion entrance. The heavy, original timber doors of the ice house swung open, inviting the public into the climate-controlled vault where history had been kept safe from the rot of the world. She stepped back from the podium, watching the first wave of visitors move reverently into the structure. The Forgotten Legacy had finally stepped out of the dark. As she walked off the stage side by side with her chief curator, she took a deep, clear breath of the autumn air, knowing that she hadn't just survived the winter of her life, she had mastered it.